Hello, and welcome to the Let's Talk Transformation podcast. Today, we're going to dive deep into the strategies that drive successful leadership and successful transformation in the digital age. I have the privilege of speaking with Michael Schank, author of Digital Transformation Success. Michael, welcome to the show.
Susie, it's such a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you on the show. Michael, your recent book has been built on years of your own operational experience, research, insight
Yeah.
into, I'm going to call it, into how to future-proof your digital transformation initiatives, but also the operational shift that organizations need to make and that leaders clearly face when they're trying to integrate digital change and digital transformation into their companies or into their teams. I think that's every leader and every organization's challenge, isn't it, currently? And your book focuses heavily on what makes digital transformation successful, the million-dollar question, let's put it that way. But in the introduction of your book, the first thing that really jumped out at me is when you state that it's clear that the disconnect that exists across teams, frameworks, and deliverables is always very clear. So, given your book, how it's constructed, and we can talk about that later, I thought this was a great place to start in terms of, can you tell us more about that trio, Michael, of teams, frameworks, and deliverables?
Yeah. So most of my experience has been in consulting,
Hmm.
working with large financial services organizations. So I come from practical experience helping organizations tackle their transformation challenges. And through that time, I realized that, you see the same patterns across organizations, and that
Mm.
is that any good size organization has a lot of complexities in their
Yeah.
people, technology, their data, you name it. They evolve over time, and it's not necessarily in a planned way,
Yeah.
and that there's so much confusion and that nobody knows what's going on with everything within the organization. Really, we just have blinders on. We know what
Mm.
what happens very well within our organization, but we don't know the broader landscape. We don't know how things work. We don't know how resources are leveraged, et cetera. So that disconnect, and I'll break down those three parts. So
Mm.
on teams is really all about silos. So we
Yeah,
know what our
totally.
team does well, but if you kind of get into the periphery of our vision, we have a less and less understanding of what other teams do, and that really inhibits effective collaboration and even just knowledge.
Mm.
So I have a general idea what they do, but I don't really know how to go to them or what they should do for me. With frameworks, there's a lot of different frameworks out there in transformations. You got
Yeah.
Agile, you got Lean Six Sigma, you got all these transformation frameworks, et cetera, but there's no unifying thread that ties them together.
Hmm.
Um, and then deliverables, you could have, requirements documents or risk assessments or, you name it. There's a
Mm.
lot of different deliverables that are created during a transformation, but there's no unifying thread that ties that all together. So really what my book focuses on is what is that unifying thread?
Mm.
And ultimately it should be, what does the business do? So
Mm.
if we could have clarity about what the business does in a broad level from a strategy perspective and a detailed level, all connected in one framework,
Mm.
then ultimately we could get everyone one common language or one common understanding, so that we could get to alignment. And alignment
Mm.
really is two things. It's vertical alignment, so everything from the C level suite down to the individual contributor is tied together so that everyone is working on the same page of where the organization's going, and then horizontal alignment so that we could break down those silos and teams can work together effectively.
Mm. Totally. And I think, coming back to the framework discussion, Agile or Lean Six Sigma or, process business engineering or process excellence, operational excellence. It's all about framing, of course, but I think there's also this need to have more clarity, more accountability, more understanding of what's going on. And of course, the flatter the organization gets, which is today's trend in terms of working in ecosystems and things like that. And of course, digital enables us, doesn't it, to go end to end from a data perspective across platforms, across boundaries, across silos. So I want to come back to your process inventory framework, which is your guiding thread of, keeping these things aligned, afloat, and also effective. Can you walk us through your framework, and why it's called process inventory framework? Although we understand the words, I think it's really interesting, Michael, what you put behind it and how you sort of knit those threads to create this aligned vision of what you're actually doing throughout the digital transformation?
Yeah, so it's a very simple concept if you really think about it, is inventorying every single process that you do as an organization. So I know that breaks from conventional thinking in process management and
Hmm.
transformation. Because a lot of process management will be, make sure you get your core processes, which I totally get. But an understanding of every single process,
Mm,
even the ones that aren't core that may seem bureaucratic, like they all have an impact on how the organization operates. So what process inventory is just building that inventory of processes by starting at the top of the organization. So you go to the core leadership and you ask them a question
mm,
by organizational unit. What is it that your organization does? And they'll break it down by the different groups and they'll tell you who leads those different groups. And then you go down and ask those leaders what their teams do. And you keep repeating that process, walking down the organizational hierarchy until you have until you get down to the process level.
mm,
Um, and then and that can be aided by AI, can help discern things like what's your procedures and help you get kind of a starting inventory. But
mm,
ultimately, I think you need to talk to people
mm,
because there's obviously limitations with AI. But then once you have that inventory, you go back and you have people attest to it. Is this accurate and complete? And I like to capture it in a formal email or some other electronic version, and I walk up the organizational hierarchy, repeating that process to have everyone validate. Yes, this is an accurate and complete representation of what we do as an organization, because that we need that so that they can trust it and use it for decisions like planning transformations and running the business, et cetera. So it's a really simple concept. It's
mm,
inventorying every single process that you do, and that becomes your common language or semantic structure to drive all kinds of transformation and
mm.
operational excellence programs.
Because you're basically providing clarity, aren't you? The famous clarity from strategy to execution. So, through strategy, tactics, through all levels of the organization. But for me, you're also embarking on a sense-making mission at every
Yes.
single level process of the organization. And so, in the first part of your book, you talk about foundations for success of a successful digital transformation. The first one being why and understanding what you're transforming. Let's put it that way, the drivers of the transformation. And the second one being the process inventory framework, which clearly is a lot more than just, doing an inventory of processes. Um, but that's how it starts, of course, because the clarity starts from, having this exhaustive list of clear, aligned, understood processes. Can you tell us more then? I mean, they're the first two blocks, aren't they, of your foundations for success? And the third one is around defining a digital initiative for success. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? And can you give us some operational examples, Michael? Because I think, as ever, digital transformation often looks good on a piece of paper. And then when you actually get to it, it's quite messy. And, I think it is one of the huge questions of why did that work and is it scalable?
Yeah, so the ultimately, and I'll break down that term digital transformation. So
Yeah.
transformation is just a profound way that you operate your business and deliver value to your
Mm,
customers. It's a large change, and the digital part is just integrating new technologies to achieve that, to better align to what your customers are looking for, and to drive efficiency and boost margin in how you
mm,
run your business. And then it's also about digitizing data.
yeah.
But once you have that clear roadmap, and you can start with the strategy of where are we going, and when organizations define their strategy process, one of the first steps they do is they do an environment analysis. And
Mm.
that could be your external environment. So what are my competitors doing? What's the economic, and now what's the trade environment, et
Mm.
cetera. And then there's an internal analysis, which is where are we strong and where are we weak relative to where we need to be.
Mhm.
Uh, and if you have that clear map of here's all my processes, now you could use that to really create a heat map that says
Mm.
here's where we're strong, here's where we're weak, here's what we need to improve. But that becomes important with optimizing your change budget. So where am I going to put my finite transformation dollars to make sure I'm having the greatest impact.
Mm,
That's where this structure comes in, because now I could be very precise and say these are the things that I need to change, and then it actually flows down throughout the rest of the program. So I could now say when I start my projects, what specific processes, when I scope them, what specific processes are impacted, who are the owners of those processes, what resources, and I failed to mention that in the beginning of what process inventory is. It's not only a structure of what the processes are, but it's an
mm,
integration of operational data. So organizations manage a wealth of data about how they run their business. They have
mm,
systems repositories, they have third-party catalogs that they partner with, they have the HR organization maps,
mm.
risk controls, they have all that stuff. But if you have all of that integrated in one database of everything you do, now when I'm driving a change, I could say, this is the process, this is the owner, this is the technology, and I could erase that confusion and chaos and very clear on what people need to do to achieve the transformation success.
It's interesting because it segues into one of the other questions I had, particularly around data
Yep.
and, scaling digital initiatives and how you can manage the integration of new technologies into existing legacy systems without disrupting day-to-day operations. Also a big question I think that's on everybody's mind when we decide that we're going to change systems or put in more data-driven ways of working or, you know, harmonize databases into a data lake or whatever it is.
Yep.
How have you seen people deal with that? And what would be your advice around scaling more data-driven ways of working?
So data driven, and I wrote this in my book that with the decade ending 2020,
Mm,
we've had a 5,000 increase in the amount of data. And I
mm,
mean, with our smartphones,
yeah.
everything's tracking. There's data everywhere. So we run the risk of just being just inundated and not being able to
Mm,
separate the true operational signals from the noise.
which we are, I
So
think, quite often.
we
Still
are, right?
today, you know?
There's just so much data, and you really
Mm,
can't discern what is even true, what is important, how do I drive my decision making. And that's where having this framework of putting that data in the proper business context of what's
hmm
important um, is really critical. To your first part of the question, there's with the integration of legacy systems,
mm,
obviously you have to do the same techniques that have always existed of prioritizing, looking for quick wins, doing it slow, measured approach, et cetera. But having that clarity on the intersection between what you do or your processes to serve your business, to operate your business, to serve your customers, and the technology environment. And I think that's lacking in many ways. So if you could understand what systems or technology supports each process, but you could even
mm,
go deeper, which is if I have a process map, the lowest level activity may be I click a button to say send a payment to somebody. Well,
mm,
that now is going to trigger a bunch of APIs on the back end, business logic, data that flows. And if I could get that mapping all the way through, now I've connected the dots all the way from the top level strategy of my organization all the
mm.
way down to the bowels of technology. And I think that clarity and understanding will really help with planning and being precise in how you change the environment and deploy new digital technologies and the integration of legacy without disruption.
Mm. And I think it brings me to another thought I often have, but that is sparked by what you're saying around how digital and data particularly can enable empowerment if we come back to the agile framework, of organizations wanting to create more adaptive, flexible ways of working. And how can operational leaders therefore use data analytics to create these data-driven workflows to empower people? Because I'm understanding that the starting point is to understand your processes, understand the data, understand where it's going and
Yeah.
why. But that's not all that we can do with data analytics, is it? And I feel that data analytics is a little bit now like lean was in its day. It's like, oh, lean can solve everything. But the question was maybe how? So I'm interested in your thoughts on data analytics and how they can create those workflows.
Yeah, so there's a lot there, but I would first start with cascading of goals down to individual process. So the organization will be guided by whatever their strategic imperative, and that could be driving costs down or serving customers better. There's a whole long list of different goals and metrics. But if you could start to cascade that down through what are my process areas down to individual processes, then that's one thing, is just being clear on what is the goal of each process down to an individual metric, and then how am I going to get those numbers to support it. And then there's another aspect of process inventory, which I didn't mention, which is clear accountability. So when I create this process inventory, it's really a taxonomy, a structure all the way down from the top of the organization down to individual processes, but being clear on who owns that process, and not just from a change perspective, but also operating it. So, but it's a hierarchical ownership. You don't just own your process. Your boss has some level of ownership. Their boss has some level of ownership. So making sure that, if you get that cascading of goals and metrics down to individual processes, and it all links up to what the overall mission is, and then you have clear accountability, now people can decipher what data is important for them based on alignment with those metrics.
And do you think that they also all have the same understanding of the data that's in the system? Because you can have legacy systems that are full of data that nobody really knows what's in there. They sort of have an idea depending on how long they've been there or depending on their job. So it's interesting to see how data analytics can be used. Would your advice be to look at that first before you look at doing the process inventory, or can they both be done in parallel, or does one not need to be done? Or
I would definitely start with the process inventory, but what I think what you're really discussing is the problem of data lineage. And I've worked in banking, I've worked with several clients that struggled with data lineage, especially when it came to like customer statements and regulatory reports, because data comes from so many different places and it transforms in so many different places. And if you don't know that lineage of how did it, because it could be somebody in the chain being like, I don't like those numbers, I'm going to change them, but there's no real traceability or documentation of what was behind the decision, and is it even true? So I think a clarity of and that's a big challenge, obviously, but I think clarity of your processes will help you just uncover kind of, give you a structure to understand what are the points that data is moving around from, and where are they transforming and who's transforming it, so that you could have better trust in the data you're driving your decisions off of.
And I think, and it comes back, doesn't it, to accountability, which we've already touched on, but I think is a big one. Accountability in process ownership, accountability in data ownership. But technology is often the focal point in digital transformation, and rightly so. But you also emphasize the people side of things, which is also a huge part in success of digital transformation. And how do you see leaders creating operational structures that can foster a culture of adaptability, Michael? And it's the accountability segue that I'm using, because I think accountability is key for lots of things, but particularly in more decentralized decision-making areas.
I think accountability is huge. I think there's also another aspect of the culture which you're mentioning, and I think that's giving people autonomy so it's all based on an understanding of everybody has some expertise on what they do. So if you could tap into that expertise and give them autonomy to drive improvements in what they do day to day, then now you're really taking your entire workforce and enabling them to be a driver for innovation. And what that means is you've got with autonomy is build a culture that we want to try new things. We encourage you to test new ideas, understanding that everything's going to work out, but through that we're going to get nuggets of greatness. And if you have the structure of accountability and everyone knows kind of what processes they own, all the resources that's used, et cetera, you're really arming your workforce with a full and detailed understanding of how things work, how processes work end to end, the resources involved, et cetera. So if you could combine those two things, now people can test these ideas and really drive improvements in their processes. So I
Mm,
think it's and I wrote about this in my book. There's a
mm,
couple of organizations that have really succeeded in that, and yeah, I think it's a different mindset shift in terms of, instead of innovation being purely top down or in some
mm,
centralized innovation team, that really everyone has some role in it.
mm. And as you said, you give a couple of examples in your book, but it would be great if you could just sort of walk us through what made them successful in what they did.
Yeah. So one example was 3M.
Mm,
And I forgot the stats in it. It's been a while since I've read this, but they encourage everyone to spend a certain portion of their work week
mm,
on driving innovation, and they've come up through this whole process of a couple products like the sticky note,
yeah.
and some other
Everybody's
products
favorite.
that everyone's favorite, right? Where that was just people, spending some of their weekly time thinking about new things and coming up and testing these ideas, and then, oh, look, it's a market success.
Nice.
Yeah. So, but that's not just with new products. That could be in processes, like in
Mm,
these organizations, and especially from my consulting vantage points. You walk into these, and people are so grounded in the current ways of thinking that they can't get out of it. So me
mm,
coming as an outsider, I'm like, why do you do this? This doesn't really make sense, because they've evolved, and it's kind of one of those, the frog in the boiling pot. You
yeah.
either throw him in, or he starts. When you start with the cold water and then it heats
Mm,
up, you don't know to jump out.
mm.
And so injecting some of that external perspective and think about things in a different way is important.
Because it's interesting, in your book, you talk about the foundations and you also talk about applying, transforming the ways of working and then the implementation of process inventory framework. Can you tell us a little bit more about the difference between applying and implementing? Because for me, the execution of those two stages on the hypothesis that we understand the foundation blocks is
Mhm.
really interesting to understand. And I would imagine that you have quite a lot of learning there from seeing people who've only inverted commas applied and never implemented, or who have skipped that stage and tried to implement. It's really interesting to hear your insights into what's worked and what hasn't worked.
So it all starts with this foundation.
Yeah.
So in order to inventory every process, you're going to have to build a process capability, or a process center of excellence. You need
Mm,
a group of people that are responsible for not only building and creating this structure of information, but you have to maintain it, because organizations change all the time.
yeah.
There's reorgs, there's system changes, really on a daily basis.
Mm,
So you need this organization to build it, do the data integration, but then on a periodic basis, continue to go, and it could be 6 months, 3 months, 6 months, whatever it is, go back out to the business and ask them, is this still correct?
mm,
And then they'll make changes, you do some reattestation, and you make sure that foundation is fresh. But then on the usage side, you really have to, so once you have the foundation, now you need to get people to use it,
yeah.
because that's what the value is.
Mm,
And that's things like, how do I use it for strategy? So I already mentioned the process, but
yeah.
how do I get this map into the leaders so that they can use it for that internal and external environment analysis that I mentioned? How do you change how you do drive change within the organization? And that's your whole life cycle of, how do I scope projects? How do I do requirements? How do I do design? How do I do testing? Organizational change management,
Mm,
educating people, creating good procedures, doing training, et cetera. But how do I embed that in the lens and how those deliverables are created? Back to your first question,
mm,
making sure that they're all anchored to this the same thing. How do I do risk management? Risk management is really an understanding of, and as ISO 31000 states, risk
mm,
is the uncertainty of objectives. Well,
mm.
how do you reach objectives? By doing things, i.e. processes. So
Yeah.
embedding that, when risk teams do risk assessments and prioritize controls, create regulatory reports, that they're using this common thread of the business understanding. I could go on. There's
Mm,
doing enterprise architecture, doing operational efficiencies,
mm,
really embedding this in how you
mm.
drive change and run the organization.
But I just want to come back to the risk thing. the risk
Yes.
management discussion because I think organizations and humans are by nature risk averse because
Yep.
we like to know and we like to be sure it's going to work and things like that. And clearly, in today's world, we don't know that. And
Yes.
technology and the rate at which it evolves means that we're even less certain. So, how do you see organizations and leaders managing risk in today's world? And by today's world, I mean, the whole cyber discussion, the fact that it moves on so quickly, the fact that, people can hack into data so quickly. So that is an almost overwhelmingly fast-moving part of risk. What reactions do you see to risk management there, Michael?
Honestly, in today's world, I don't think they do it well.
Okay.
And
Okay, fair enough.
the core of risk management, and I've worked with a lot of banks,
Yes,
I've read about, and so coming from where you're at, DORA, which is the
yes,
Digital Operational
yes.
Resiliency, is a really good thing to point to, is in that regulation states that you need to be resilient in everything you do, have an understanding of your critical business processes, but you also have to reach into your third party vendors and know what they're doing
Mm,
and make sure that they're being responsible as well. And organizations, when they have a risk program and they have something called GRC,
mm,
governance risk compliance, it's a technology or a tool, and the foundation of that is a data model. And that data model has to be anchored on what is the business context.
yeah.
And ultimately, in that data model, it's what are my processes, what are the risks on the processes, and what are the controls. But many risk programs fail in that first part, which is the taxonomy of processes. So what I've seen is they maybe implement some generic taxonomy for their entire business unit,
Mm,
and in my experience, like I was working at a big bank, and they had one taxonomy that described everything the business did. But the business did, mortgage
lots of
and
different things.
banking and credit cards and wealth management. Well, that one taxonomy doesn't describe what those
Mm,
groups do.
mm,
So when people on the ground are doing risk assessments, they don't know, like they look at this taxonomy and says it doesn't reflect what I do. So they do a lot of interpretations when they're identifying risks and identifying controls and whatnot. And that really creates poor data, that creates confusion in all the people involved in the risk management program, from the
mm,
frontline business to risk oversight teams to internal audit, et cetera. It creates poor reporting for regulators and for management. So
mm,
there's a lot of problem with it. But if you could base that foundation on a true inventory of your processes specific to each business, now
mm,
you can drive clarity on what your real risks are, and then how you control for that. And then coming back to Dora, is if you can map out every single process, now you could have better interaction with your business, saying these are really the critical processes. When I say critical, is if there's an adverse event like a storm or
mm,
political strife or whatever it may be, these are the processes that I need to maintain. Like people need
mm,
access to their money, for instance, in a banking context. But then because I've mapped all the resources, here's the third parties, here's the systems, here's the people, here's everything. Now I could make sure, then I could work with my technology teams and my risk teams to fortify those resources to make sure that in those adverse events that they're still operational.
mm. And are you seeing people more reticent or less reticent, therefore, to have the risk conversation, Michael?
Well, in general, I think there's a certain population of any organization that is married to the current way of thinking.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, 85%.
85%. Yeah, exactly. Right. So whenever you're talking about this, you're always looking for who are the people that
Mm,
are married to the current ways of thinking, and who are the new thinkers that can break out of that and think of a different way of working.
mm,
And when you're creating this process strategy or process capability, you have to seek out those people that are open to new ways of thinking, especially at the leadership level. So you could build champions and supporters that could tell the story, that could knock down or open doors for you, et cetera. So
mm,
that's when I always advise people of when you're doing this, find those champions, tell the story, get their backings, but also start small. Just take one small area of the business, do this, solve whatever problem that they're really pressed with through this visibility, and then continue to tell the story to the rest of the organization,
Mm.
to convert some of those people that are current ways of thinking type
Mm.
people.
And it's a different lens though, isn't it? The way you're working with your consumers, your customers, your no, it's more partnership as opposed to ownership, particularly
Exactly.
from a data and process point of view of, this is your business context, this is the data or whatever I can provide, and what do we do with it, and what do you want, and how can we create that? And I think that's
Exactly.
quite a big discussion, which leads me to risk may therefore be shared.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's all about just that clarity and
Mm.
understanding what risks are incurred by processes, what
Mm.
regulatory obligations do I have to, um, you know, and mapping those regulatory obligations to process. But
Mm.
once you have that clarity in what process, then that shared risk, you understand who the process owner is. But if I map it to technology, I understand who owns that technology. I
Mm.
understand the third party relationships and who owns that, the point of context.
Mm.
Really, I create a map of accountability throughout the organization. So when I identify risk, I could be very clear on the ways to mitigate it.
Yeah, and whose responsibility lies where, and yeah, every scenario. But and if I come back, that's a journey in itself. But digital transformation is a journey, isn't it, for individual leaders, but also for teams and organizations. And how,
Yeah.
therefore, do you think that they should be measuring success of digital transformation initiatives, which are huge? So clearly, we're not going to wait years to measure it. I'm presuming that there is some type of iterative measurement, but can you give us an insight into two things: what your framework says
Mhm.
and what you've seen working and not working in terms of measuring success?
Yeah, well, there's really two parts of it. The first one is it comes back to the why. Why are you doing this transformation?
Mm,
So, are you doing it to change your business model and achieve growth? Are you doing it for operational efficiency and the bottom line, et cetera? But ultimately, anchoring it in a very clear understanding of why are we doing this, and then
mm,
building measures around that. The second part is the implementation. So, and I write, and this is a very ubiquitous stat, that 70% of digital transformations fail. That, by the way, that's been challenged online in some of my posts. So who knows if that's real or not? But
Well, because apparently it's bigger or smaller. That's the interesting question. Is it being challenged
yeah,
like bigger or smaller?
yeah, and it also comes to the question is define failure.
Yes. Yeah, yeah.
But But failure, I think, could mean many different things. You miss your budget wildly, and I've seen a lot of programs that estimate, say 10 million, and they're in the 40 million range, or some other number. You miss your timelines, or you miss the functionality that you're aiming to deliver. So I think that's the other part of measuring how
Mm,
you're actually driving these programs, and having that precision of what exact processes are we changing, what are we changing them to, can really mitigate that implementation risk. And I've seen it all the time. I've been in large programs where it's just absolute chaos and confusion, and develop. And I think the other core to this is, all the different practitioner teams speak a different language.
yeah.
So business folks have, like, they just thinking about what they have to deliver to their customers. Technology folks are just thinking about what do I have to implement. But
Mm.
there's really many times a disconnect from them, and that's where this process inventory can become that common language that bridges the divide between all these different groups.
And so what do you measure therefore? Do you start on the bottom line measurement right from the early stages? Or how does that work? Because you've just got a map of every single process in the organization. Therefore, like you said, an accountability heat map
Yeah,
almost
yeah,
of where it gets complex, where it doesn't get complex, if there are areas where it's less clear, more clear. How does that help us to measure
yeah.
as we go along?
So in the first part of why you're doing this, and I'll
Mm,
just take one example to pick on.
mm,
Let's say you're trying to drive costs down and
mm,
improve margin. You could use this map and all the resources in there
mm,
to do an allocation of where my costs are, relative to the value that these areas produce. So if I know my underlying, say, operating cost, I can start allocating it to different areas, and the technology costs and everything, so that when I'm driving change, now I could see the difference in, oh, look, my licensing costs for technology is going down. I don't need as many people to support this area, et cetera. So that's really critical. And then in the implementation side, it's getting down to, let's say your budget and timeline is, I think this certain area was going to cost me, say, $1 million to transform. Am I on schedule? I could really break down this journey into different stages and
Mm,
allocate dollars in each stage and see if I'm really meeting that, through this lens of just transparency and understanding of how it's impacting the process and how the deliverables are achieving to it. So it really just becomes that common thread to align every single measure to.
mm. And I like the idea that it's fully transparent and that, you can see, maybe not a glance, but you can see with one look what's going on and where your problem areas might be in terms of scaling.
Yeah, and this comes back to alignment is, in an organization, I really think leaders only have a good understanding of maybe two or three levels down of what's
Yes,
going on.
yes, totally
Because
agree.
if you go beyond that, the story you hear is the story that's crafted for you.
Yeah, yes, yeah.
It may not be the real story,
Mm,
but if you could really break this down, now you could have leaders, and there's a lot of trend, especially in the tech industries, where leaders will roll up their sleeves and go
yeah,
down to and work with engineering teams and
yeah,
resolve issues. But you can't do that unless you have clarity on who does what and what actually is happening on the ground. And having this visibility, now you could drive down in a very tangible way and say, I understand all the processes, I understand what's going on here. Now, if I believe that there's a pain point here, now I can work with the teams and say, give me the true story of what's going on and how do we resolve this?
mm. So they can go back to the lean idea of going Gemba and then taking it up to where it's not being understood.
Exactly,
Yeah,
exactly.
totally. Okay. Michael, time is running. I have a couple more questions. This is quite a hard question. What's your biggest learning from your involvement with digital transformation initiatives to date and everything you learned from your research of your book and writing it up and all the case studies? What still jumps out at you as, oh my goodness, that was either surprising or I didn't see it coming or, yeah,
Actually, I would say not surprising because when I was in consulting, and I told myself, don't ever be surprised with what you see because underlying many organizations, almost all of them, there's a certain level of just confusion and chaos and complexity
in general. Yeah.
in general, and nobody has an answer to
No,
that. And it comes back to that framework question of, yeah, all the you got agile and lean six
yeah,
sigma, business architecture, and all these different things, but nobody has solved it fundamentally. And I've kind of kept seeing these patterns, and that's why I created this framework. Is how are we going to tackle this beast and get to an area of where we can have a true understanding? Let me mention one other thing that I think is important, which is the integration of AI.
yeah,
And I read this report and it was Deloitte's State of the AI report, and they interviewed leaders and said, where do you want AI to go next? And the plurality of respondents said they want to integrate AI deeply into their processes and functions. Well, you can't do that unless you know what your processes are.
totally. Yeah, yeah.
And it gets into this, there's this concept called digital twin, which is
Mm,
just a virtual model of your real world environment. And this is a real thing that's been big in manufacturing, and I write
mm,
about it. I think John Deere and smart
yes.
factories. But if you
Mm,
could create a model of what your environment is at a detailed level, now you're educating AI on how everything works. And if you could feed it data like your customer complaints, your defects, your issues, it could really tell you in a pinpoint manner where there's problems, where there's inefficiencies, and how you can resolve them. That concept hasn't translated from manufacturing, which is physically
mm,
tangible, somewhat easy to map out,
yes.
to a information-based business like a bank
Mm,
or other businesses. And that's where I think process inventory could be a key enabler to really drive down as what does my business do, and then enable AI to do predictive analytics and simulations and real, better
mm,
data-driven decision making.
mm,
Uh, and I think that's where, and that's hoping that's where it goes is this greater clarity.
yeah.
can enable greater use of AI.
A little bit how we adapted lean for transactional environments. It's easy when you see it coming off the production line, the waste, things like that. But those concepts of flow and waste and added value in a more transactional environment took quite a while, didn't it, to sort of flow down, should I say, into the sort of transactional part. So,
Exactly.
okay, yeah, here's hoping. Michael, if you had a final call to action to our listeners, what would it be for those sat there thinking, okay, yeah, either I get what I need to do, or I really need to start thinking about how to make our digital initiative successful.
First is if you like what I'm saying, I detail it out in my book.
Yeah.
So go to Amazon. It's Digital Transformation Success. Pick it up. Engage with me online. So I'm on LinkedIn. I post regularly. So and reach out to me. Let's have a conversation. I'm always up for hearing people's stories and having good conversations about how to tackle challenges. And then I provide my own consulting. So if you're interested in learning, if you're interested in adapting to this and implementing something like a process inventory framework to drive clarity, go to processinventory.com and reach out to me, and we could talk about the services I could provide or training.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. I was going to ask you where can our listeners find out more about you and what you do, but you've
That's
illustrated
very
that brilliantly for us. So I'm going to leave them with the call to action of picking up your book and really having an understanding of how they navigate that clarity and accountability from the top of the organization to the bottom. Thank you,
well.
Michael.
I guess I'll say one other call to action is, and this is not a surprise to anyone, but the world is changing at an incredibly fast pace, and the advancement of technologies, all the trade stuff that's going on.
Yeah.
So I think it's the time is now to really have an understanding of what your business does and use that as a platform for change.
Okay, excellent. The time is now. Thank you for that, Michael. Thanks for a great conversation.
Excellent. Thank you for having me, Susie.
It's been a pleasure. Thank
Thank
you.
you.